Welcome back to another video, people, and we're here today to learn about composition with the one and only Garry Winogrand. And Garry Winogrand was a prolific street photographer. He worked mainly from the 60s up until the really early 80s, and that is because unfortunately he passed away in 1984. And throughout the course of his career, he put together 4 main monographs. And so if you'd like an episode of books on one of his photo books, let me know down below. But before we do that, and before we talk about composition and we dive deep into that, let me just tell you briefly about 3 things I learned with Garry Winogrand. When I started to look at Winogrand's images and reading about his career, I realized how much he actually shot, and it is thought that he left more than 6,000 rolls of film behind when he died. Now, I'm not someone who would photograph at this crazy rate, but what I've learned with Winogrand's example is that inevitably it's with practice that I will learn and grow as a photographer, because in the photography field, experience is a big key to develop our so-called photographic eye. And so I definitely don't shy away from shooting more often, going out more often, looking for photographs, and sometimes I do this and I might not even end up shooting anything I think it's worth it. But the sole exercise of going out and looking, it's like training a muscle to perform. And the more we train it, the more it will perform, at least in my opinion. So don't shy away from going out and taking different shots, perhaps taking multiple shots of the same thing, because sometimes a slight movement, detail, gesture is enough to make a different image. And the second thing I learned from Winogrand is to definitely put an effort into learning about form and content. And these are 2 very distinct things in photography. And what I'm proposing here is that we pay attention to a photograph as a whole. Don't focus just on learning about the form of a photograph and the rules that apply to composition, lines, and the more technical aspects of a photo, but also don't just focus solely on what is happening in the photograph. And this is what I take from certain quotes by Winogrand, like every photograph is a battle of form versus content, or perhaps another one like great photography is always on the edge of failure. Because what this suggests to me is that photography lies on a certain balance between form and content, which we should learn about. So don't focus on getting the better gear and following all the rules. Focus on learning about everything, which leads me to the 3rd lesson, which is the importance of being open and receptive to take inspiration from everywhere. And this came to me when I read an interview I found on a website called American Suburbs, and the interviewer asked Winogrand if he ever took ideas from things other than photography, and he replied, a heck of a lot. Reading and music and painting and sculpture, even basketball, baseball, hockey, etc. Certainly, you can always learn from somebody else. And this, I feel, it's pretty self-explanatory. Okay, so we've studied a lot of different photographers here on the channel, as you know, if you've been following the channel. And certain photographers are known for cropping their photos, and for instance, examples of that, very famously, perhaps, Robert Frank with the Americans, and we've seen that in the video. And also Lisette Model, whose kind of like uncropped images I had access to on the internet. And so this led me to think that comparing this with like certain photographers like Cartier-Bresson or Winogrand, who say don't crop your photo, don't kind of like narrow it down, it kind of made me think of the role of context, because more often than not, you crop a photo because either it's too busy or you want to focus on a specific detail. And this is what I found when I saw certain examples of this. And so for me, this led me to think, what happens when we don't do that in a photo? What is the role of context? What happens when we leave more air, let's put it this way, more space in the composition? And I think I might have gotten some interesting thoughts that I'd like to share with you. And here we have some examples from Robert Frank. And, well, looking at these images, cropping really seems to be made to give a focus to the main character or detail in the photograph. So let me highlight those for you. What is cropped is not necessarily that much and doesn't change the image itself, but this can lead to, in my opinion, a dangerous trap. That is, we lean on the comforting thought that if it doesn't work out, we can crop it later, which might prevent us from getting the best possible composition we can in camera. And this is where I think Cartier-Bresson and Winogrand might be coming from. So if we commit to not cropping our photos, pretend say it doesn't exist, we will probably be encouraged to try out different compositions around the same subject, realize what context can give or take away within the same image or situation. And context usually can provide critical information about a certain situation, establish relationships between foreground and background, but also set a mood in a specific picture or work. And when I look at street photos, for instance, I don't mind the frenzy, the mix of backgrounds and textures, because to me it's always incredible how in that sort of environment a photographer is able to see a detail and capture it. And so with Winogrand, I think I understood the importance of trying out different compositions, and of course the importance of giving context to the situation that is happening and to the viewer. And we talked about shape before on the channel. We talked about composing around shape. And I think Winogrand was a great reminder that, you can compose around shape and not so much have shape as associated to an object, a building, but it can also be a person and the detail of that person. And I actually selected two very particular photos of his that I feel like really explain what shape can do for your photo and how you can compose around shape. In these examples, I feel like shape defines relationships between foreground and background, directs our eyes into casting a light into certain details like a facial expression, a hand, a shadow. But particularly in the picture of the man next to the car, shape really defines the proportions in that image, and for sure blocks any distractions and makes us more focused on what matters to us in the photo. So with Winogrand, I was reminded that shape can be a guiding element in composition. The way two shapes coexist, the relationship they establish, can be interesting to explore when we're out and about photographing. And I feel like one of the most interesting things in Winogrand's photography is without a doubt his ability to see lines and directions. And there's a handful of images in particular that serve literally as a masterclass on how to establish different directions or combine perspectives in one image. And what this does to your photography is adding more energy to your images and for sure turning them more dynamic. So studying images like his earlier zoo images, or maybe just paying more attention to his street scenes, will definitely reveal a key for the vibrancy of his photography because it establishes different directions. And of course here he didn't manipulate reality, he just simply looked for this intersection, clashing or opposite elements that suggest different angles and directions, which I think it's a great lesson for us photographers. Our friend depth. Now, we've talked about depth many times before on the channel, and it's interesting that, of course, the more photographers we study, the more perspectives on depth we can have. And with Winogrand, I was reminded that depth can be taken in its literal sense, like the depth of field of a photo, but it can also be something about the emotional or the power of the photo towards the viewer, the impression that it casts. And I feel like sometimes it's interesting to explore this type of depth, like I say, an emotional or maybe a not so formal depth in the photograph. And so Winogrand reminded me through certain images of his that we can achieve this through many different ways. And so I selected a few photos that to me personally remind me of how depth can be achieved in a photograph. In its formal sense, we can talk about depth of field, which is achieved by lines, low angles, tilted perspectives, shapes, and the position of certain subjects. But these elements combined with color, great color contrast, dramatic elements, say a facial expression, the direction of the eyes, or gestures, can add a certain emotional depth to the photograph. And these are my thoughts on Garry Winogrand. So, if you'd like to see more of Garry Winogrand on his channel, let me know, of course, down below. And I guess that, as usual, I want to thank you for everything, for watching, supporting the channel, buying prints, reaching out to me on social media, coming and following my work. I really, really appreciate it. And I guess that's all for today. So stay safe, keep shooting, film digital, whatever you do, subscribe for a cookie or two, and I'm out. Peace.